What's up, CoderByte? Welcome back to another data structures and algorithms video. I'm Elizabeth, and today we are going to be doing our final video in our systems design series. I hope you all have enjoyed this so far. I've really enjoyed this as well. It's really interesting to think about how all of these very common, everybody uses these tools, and to think about how they're built is kind of fun. We're almost at 10,000 subscribers, which is super exciting. So if you haven't already, make sure you like this video and subscribe to our channel. We have awesome content coming down the pipeline, all interview related, algorithm related, data structures related, tech related, all the good stuff. So definitely be sure to do that if you want to be notified all about the future stuff we're doing here at CoderByte. And with that, let's get into this week's problem. The problem. Design a vacation rental marketplace such as Airbnb, in which a user can book different vacation properties and host can post properties on the marketplace. Okay, I think everybody knows what Airbnb is. So this is a really cool idea, I think, because you can kind of take the concepts we talk about in this video, and this is going to be, specifically to Airbnb, but this kind of extends to any booking software. So you could think of this as like another hotel booking software like booking.com or one of those other sorts of, vacation rental property sites. Or you can even kind of take this towards like a WeWork direction, right? Like a room booking software. This is almost also similar to another problem I've seen on the internet, which is design a parking garage. That's also kind of thinking about booking different things at different times for different people. So this is a cool problem because we're going to talk about it in respect to Airbnb, but this could be extended to all different sorts of use cases. So first, let's go over our system design recap and how we generally approach any system design question. So first, we scope the problem. This is where we interview the interviewer, right? We ask them all sorts of questions so that we can, at the get-go, know exactly what we're trying to build. Number two, capacity estimation. That's where we think about, how big does this system have to be? What kind of audience does the system have to serve? What's the load going to be? That sort of thing. Database design, self-explanatory. System APIs, also self-explanatory. The core algorithm, this might be an actual coding step where you actually code something that is, an algorithm that has to do with the actual product that you're building. And then finally, load balancing and caching. So for this particular video, we're going to only focus on database design, system APIs, and load balancing and caching. And, again, I think this is the real meat of any system design question, but be sure to practice all 6 steps when you're doing this yourself at home. And really try and, think out all of the different, don't jump into these steps if you're doing this in an interview or even practicing. You do want to go through each of these steps individually. Okay, so what are our requirements for Airbnb? House owner can post properties to rent. This is self-explanatory, I think, too, that someone who owns a house can actually put their properties on the website so that people can rent them. Customers can search properties. Okay. Customers can book properties. Reasonable. Customers can pay for the rentals. Also, makes sense. Customers can post reviews of the properties. And that's basically it. So it's pretty self-explanatory. Again, I'm not going to go so far into detail there because I think everybody here has probably used Airbnb or seen it and basically understands the concepts behind it. So let's talk about the high-level component overview. So all of a sudden, there's going to be a giant picture on the screen, and it's going to be a bunch of boxes. I did this in Lucidchart. If none of you have used that before to make any sort of, system diagrams, I highly recommend it. It's a very powerful tool, but it's a very busy diagram. So don't get overwhelmed. We're going to go through it piece by piece, and we're going to break it down and talk about each component of this system. And we're going to try and look at this system with a bird's eye view, kind of how you might go about designing this so that we can hit all of those requirements. All right, ready for this? Bam. All right, we got this big diagram. Okay, so before you look at this at all, I want to kind of delineate that there are almost three different apps here that we're talking about. So there's this part, right? So this is the UI app for the property owners. So that's kind of this whole piece. And of course, they're all interconnected, but this is kind of a logical piece of the app. And then we have this middle piece, which is the also UI app for the property search or the booking. So this is kind of what the customers are seeing, whereas this is what the hosts are seeing. So that's kind of this piece right here. And then finally, we have this last piece, which is just to view the bookings. And this is actually something that the property owners and the customers can look at, and they'd see this similar things when they're looking at their bookings. The customers would see their bookings for what they're, where they're going for vacation, and the property owners would see the bookings for who's coming to their property. But it's more or less going to be the same thing. And so that's this piece. So don't get overwhelmed. Those are the three kind of components of this whole system. And the reason why I broke it out into these three different pieces and didn't just do it all at once is because you can kind of see in this back end area, let's say this is like a front end area before the load balancers, and this is the back end area, that we're approaching the different kind of use cases with different back end services. So right off the bat, you can see that this property owners app, where the property owners are posting their properties, is driven by a MySQL cluster, more or less. Everything is being kept in this MySQL cluster, and that is sort of what is the back end, or part of the back end of this first component, this property owners piece. And then we go to this property search and booking. And that is slightly different, right? That we have an Elasticsearch cluster, which we'll talk about. And that is to better be able to provide a fast, fuzzy search. So what is a fuzzy search? A fuzzy search just means that if I have a property and there are a ton of words in the description and of a million different ways that I'm describing the property, by price, by locality, by number of rooms, whatever, a fuzzy search kind of just means that you can search on anything, all of those things, and maybe even also with differences, right? Like I'm going to search for one bedrooms with an ocean view, and I might get back lake view one bedrooms as well, just in case, because it's waterfront. So Elasticsearch is excellent for that because it provides a way to search over the entire, whatever you define. And it's a very fast way of searching through data, much faster and much wider. You can cast a wider net than just interfacing with a MySQL database directly. So you can see that that's kind of driving this middle piece, as well as a separate bookings MySQL cluster, which is where the bookings are stored. So that's its own component. And then finally, we have this viewing of the bookings, which is actually just, right, we're just now looking at whatever has been booked, and we're keeping that in this bookings Redis cluster. And Redis, if you don't know, is just a way of caching things. So we don't have to be checking a database every time we want to look at all the bookings, because likely someone's going to book a property and then it's going to be booked until they have the vacation and then it's over, right? So that can be cached. There's no reason why that needs to be constantly, your app does not have to constantly be doing a database query for that, because it's almost probably never going to change, right? You make the booking and that's the booking. So that's this caching layer. So I think that's important to see in this diagram, that this is broken up this way, mostly because there are different ways in which we're driving these three different, UI applications on this backend layer. Okay, so let's talk about it kind of in a little bit greater detail. So here we have our property owners, and they come to Airbnb.com or whatever, and we have a load balancer right here. Another really nice thing about kind of separating the services in this way is that you can have these three different load balancers, because there are really three different kind of components of this application, and we can load balance differently and route differently based on how the user entered the application. So here we have a load balancer, which is just for the property owners. And we have this property service, and this is the property service backend, right? And that more or less interfaces with the properties MySQL cluster. And that's where the property owners can upload and update their properties. So that's where all of the properties are stored. This then drives this property images CDN. And the property images CDN, if you don't know what a CDN is, it's a content delivery network and is useful for distributing, static data or images usually, but basically things that don't change, distributing it in a kind of locality based way so that if I'm in America or I'm in New Jersey and my friend is in Europe, they're going to get this. We're going to try and look at the same property, and they're going to be served an image that's from a server closer to them in Europe, and I'm going to be served an image from a server that's closer to me in New Jersey. And the CDN takes care of all of that. So because there's so many images related to these properties, we can use a property images CDN, and kind of distribute based on locality so that it's fast. That's the point of a CDN. We want to make it fast to get all the images to all the people. So that drives this property images CDN, which then feeds into the property search and booking, right? Because again, these are kind of three separate components, but they're all interrelated. There are arrows connecting all of them. So when the property owners upload their images and their information about the properties, that's what's then going into the UI app for the property search and booking little mini component here. So let's talk about that. So here we have the property search and booking, which also has a load balancer right here that is kind of dedicated to this entire component. And there are three sub-services that are in this app, in this layer of the, it's not really a layer, in this component of the system. So we have the search service. So that's where they're searching the properties, and that they're searching over this Elasticsearch cluster. So that's where the users can go in and search very, very quickly anything in this properties MySQL cluster, right? Okay, so then we have the booking service, which is where they actually make their bookings. And that is, behind the scenes, there's a bookings MySQL cluster. So that we store in a database as well, that when someone makes a booking, we save that, and we save that in a database. And then we have this payment service, which is, of course, could be a whole video on its own. If you guys are interested in payments or anything, Stripe, cryptocurrency related, comment below. We can definitely be sure to do that. But the payment service could be a video all on its own, but it's basically just what happens after the user, sends their money somewhere to make the booking. And finally, we have this view bookings little applet over here where the customers and the property owners can come. There's a load balancer here as well. And here's the booking management service. And this is driven all by this Redis cluster, which is just a cache of all of the bookings that were created in the booking service in this MySQL database. So that's more or less what this diagram is showing. It's a lot of little pieces, but I think it's not that complicated when you look into it, and you can kind of see these three imaginary lines over here, or two imaginary lines, whatever, to separate the three kind of components of this entire system. And the kind of those lines come about, I believe, because of the different ways we are supporting the front ends on the back end. So I think that that's something really cool and important to note. And, just because you have one system doesn't mean you only need one kind of database, or just because you have one system doesn't mean you only have one load balancer. You can kind of organize things differently along different fault lines depending on how you break down the system. So this is one way to do an Airbnb kind of system. Okay, so let's talk about some of these kind of services in a little bit greater detail here. So let's talk about the property service. So here are some of the CRUD operations for properties. This might be the API, the system API for the property service. So here we have a post route to properties to create a property. We have the get route to properties and then ID to get a specific property. We have a put, which would be an update, right, to properties, also ID, so that we can update the different properties even after we've posted them. And we also have the delete, of course, which would remove the property entirely. So let's talk about the properties database and how we might, what we might expect to see in the database for the properties. So here I have, this is MySQL, and I'm just creating a table properties. And I think the important things to note here is that we have an ID, a name, a locality ID. So this is going to be, as you can see here, a foreign key, which if you've never heard of this, that's okay, but it's a very powerful concept, is basically just an ID that is, or a field on one table that is referencing a field on another table, so that we can link this row, the properties row, to a locality, which is going to have much more information, like state, street, zip code, etc. So that's what that locality ID is. And then we have is active, which is just a tiny int, and there's definitely supposed to be a comma here, so forgive me, guys. But is active is just whether or not this property is active and should be shown as something, bookable or not. Our primary key is ID. This is pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so here we have our property images, and this might be where we store our property images. Duh. So we have ID, URL, property ID. So this is the thing that's going to link all of the images to the properties so that we know which images belong to which properties. And that's also a foreign key, which references the properties ID. And finally, we have this localities table. And this is, as I said before, this is the thing that this locality ID references, and this has all of the information all about the specifics of where the property is. So street, city, states, country, zip code, etc. So this is just kind of, pretty basic how you might organize the data for the properties. And, this would be in MySQL again. So yeah. Okay, let's talk about the booking service. So you might have a route, which is /book, and you might have a payload that has the user ID, the property ID, the start date, and the end date. And so you'd want to maintain, who's doing the booking, what are they booking, when are they starting it, and when are they ending it, right? And then this would be the table that you might have for the booking service. This would be the table in the MySQL cluster for the booking service. And this just has an ID, again, pretty self-explanatory, property ID, user ID, and a date. And now I think the important thing to note here is if I were building this, I would take, if the post body had a start date and an end date, I would actually create a booking row for every single day in the start date and the end date. And that way you can add this thing called a constraint. And a constraint basically is the database's way of making sure that certain data, there are certain rules before it adds things to this table. So what's the rule here? The rule is that there has to be a unique property ID and date. And so what that means is that if I want to book something and I give it a start date of today and an end date of next week, I would get a row for every single day between today and next week. And then if someone else tried to book it for, let's say, tomorrow, they would also try and make a row for this same property and tomorrow. But there's already a row for this property and tomorrow. And so that way we can block it. We can say it's already booked. You can't book it. It's already booked. So that's kind of a really cool way that you can use the database to enforce some of these rules. So you can do it at the database layer instead of in the application layer. And yeah, I think the things to pay attention to here is that you use this keyword constraint, and then unique is also a keyword, And then this uppercase UC underscore property date, that's something I chose that I'm naming this constraint. So I think it's UC for unique constraint, but that's just do what whatever you're working within, you can name it however they would like you to. And then you pass it the two fields, and you can pass it, there are all sorts of constraints you can use with these databases. So I thought that was kind of cool, a nice way to offload some of the work from the application to the database layer. Finally, I wanted to do something special this week and talk about what components you might use in the AWS ecosystem if you were designing this in the AWS ecosystem. So let's go over some of the components that we'll use, and then I'll show you that diagram again, the high-level component overview with some of these components in the image, so you can see exactly where and how you'd use these specific AWS components. So first, we would use Route 53. Route 53 is the domain name system, aka DNS, web service that AWS offers. So we could use that for all of our domain DNS requirements when we want to serve users our app. We can use the CloudFront CDN. So this is the CDN that you can use from AWS. We could use EC2. EC2 is just the cloud computing platform that AWS offers that allows users to kind of rent virtual computers that they can then run their own computer applications on. RDS is kind of the database system that AWS uses, so we could use this for any of our database needs. S3, this is object storage in the cloud again. So we could store our images for our properties in S3. We'd then get our URLs and the URLs for where those objects live, and use the CloudFront CDN on top of that to distribute it all over the world. The Elasticsearch service is AWS's way of kind of their interface for Elasticsearch, which is again what we'd use to search our properties. The ElastiCache is kind of the Redis equivalent in AWS land. So this would be our caching layer for that bookings component at the bottom. And finally, Elastic load balancers, which are just the load balancers that you can use in the AWS ecosystem. So it's kind of always impressive when a interviewer or interviewee knows some of these things coming in, because I think a lot of companies these days are working within the AWS ecosystem, or they're migrating to the AWS ecosystem. So it's really great to kind of have these in your toolbox as well, just to be able to talk about them and, kind of think about all of this in a real world situation where you might be working within the AWS ecosystem. So let's look at that bird's eye view component overview image one more time with all of this stuff on top of it. So here that is, even busier than before. Sorry, everybody. But essentially all I did was kind of paste all of the services, all of the AWS components over the services in which we would use them. So here in the beginning of the entire workflow, we would have Route 53 before all of these, UI apps, as like to do the DNS routing so that we could have different content served to different people going to different places on our site. Here is the Elastic load balancer, so that's just shown here. Here we have all of the property images. So here we have them in S3, and then on top of that we have the CloudFront CDN, which is then being served to the property search and booking site, right? Here is RDS instance. We could use MySQL with RDS, and that would be our database here. Here's our Elasticsearch service, which would be here for our Elasticsearch cluster. Here is another RDS instance for our bookings MySQL cluster. And then finally, we have our ElastiCache right here to, instead of using just Redis, this would be our caching layer to just show the bookings. And that's a wrap for designing Airbnb. I think I'm going to go use Airbnb to go book a vacation right now because that is what I am in the mood to do. But no, in all seriousness, I hope you all enjoyed this video. I hope you all enjoyed this series. I thought this was super fun to do, and I can continue to do more of this in a couple weeks if people want to see more system design questions like this. We're going to be back next week. We're going to do a new series. And yeah, so make sure to like and subscribe. And have a great week, everybody. See you soon. Bye.